Bismillahir-Rahman-ir-Rahim. Welcome to The Missing Dots. Tonight on The Missing Dots, we step into the mind of Ibn Taymiyyah, the scholar praised as Sheikh al-Islam and criticized as the most disruptive theologian of his era, as we uncover how his influence shaped the tafsir of Ibn Kathir and ultimately the way millions of Muslims understand the Quran today. Was his mission to simplify divine guidance, or did his interpretations create new layers of complexity and doubt? How did he justify explaining a divine text when Islamic belief holds that only prophets truly grasp Allah's intent? And why do critics, atheists, ex-Muslims, and even classical scholars claim that his methodology introduced scientific, theological, and historical challenges that still echo today? In this episode, we put his legacy on trial, confronting both the controversies and the scholarly defenses that continue to define the modern Muslim mind.
So we really have a massive historical landscape to cover tonight.
Yeah, we do.
And I actually want to start by just talking directly to you, the listener. If you were to walk into almost any mosque in the world right now,
Whether that's in Jakarta or London.
right, Cairo, Los Angeles, anywhere, if you look at the bookshelves, you're going to find a multi-volume set of books called Tafseer Ibn Kathir.
Yeah, it's just universally present.
It really is. Millions of people rely on those specific volumes to understand the Quran.
And if they get confused by a verse, they just pull that book off the shelf.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But there is this fundamental misconception about that book that we really have to clear up before we even start talking.
Right, the authorship.
Yeah.
Because people constantly blur the lines between the men involved.
Maybe do.
I've seen it happen so many times. When critics attack the methodology of the commentary, or even when supporters praise it, they direct all their energy at Ibn Taymiyyah.
Yeah, they assume he just sat down and physically wrote the volumes sitting on that shelf.
But he didn't. He didn't write a single page of Tafsir Ibn Kathir.
No, he didn't. His student did. Rijmail ibn Umar ibn Kathir wrote it later in the 14th century.
So Ibn Kathir was the one doing all the grueling, verse-by-verse compilation.
Right, he was gathering the hadith, finding the historical reports, the linguistic notes. He assembled the actual book.
So why are we focusing so much on Ibn Taymiyyah tonight?
Because he provided the framework. He wrote a text called the Muqaddimah Usul al-Tafsir.
Which translates to what exactly?
Roughly, an introduction to the principles of exegesis.
Okay, I see. So it's like, well, think of it this way. If Ibn Kathir's massive commentary is the physical building that millions of Muslims walk into every day.
Then Ibn Taymiyyah is the architect.
Right. He drew up the rigid blueprints. He dictated exactly how deep the foundation had to be.
Yeah, what specific materials were allowed to be used.
And what materials were permanently banned from the construction site.
That is actually a really helpful way to visualize it. And if you want to understand the building, you have to understand the mind of the architect.
You have to know why he insisted on those specific rigid rules.
Right. What was he so afraid of?
I want to focus on that fear for a second. Or maybe, that sense of urgent defense. Because nobody builds a fortress with massive, thick walls unless they genuinely believe they are under an existential threat.
No, absolutely not.
So we need to look at the world Ibn Taymiyyah was living in. The 13th and 14th centuries in the Islamic world, this was not a time of peaceful debate in quiet libraries.
Far from it. The world was practically burning down.
Yeah.
It was an era of profound trauma, just apocalyptic trauma. Ibn Taymiyyah was born in 1263.
Okay.
And just 5 years before his birth, in 1258, the Mongols completely sacked Baghdad.
They didn't just defeat an army, did they?
No, they completely decimated the Abbasid Caliphate.
Which had been the center of the Muslim world for, 500 years?
Exactly. The political and spiritual center of gravity just gone.
I remember reading historical accounts of that siege, and the sheer physical destruction is hard to even comprehend.
It's staggering.
The stories say the Tigris River ran black with the ink of thousands of books thrown into the water from the Grand Library.
Right.
And then it ran red with the blood of the scholars and the citizens. The psychological blow must have been shattering.
People genuinely thought the Day of Judgment had arrived. SubhanAllah, they really believed it was the end of the world.
So the physical empire is collapsing.
Yes. But the internal landscape was fracturing just as violently. The Muslim world felt like it was retreating on all fronts.
Because the Mamluk armies were trying to hold the physical line against the Mongols in Egypt and Syria.
Right. But while they were doing that, the intellectual leaders were engaged in these bitter, sometimes violent sectarian conflicts.
You had the traditionalists, the Hanbalis, fighting with the Asharis over theology.
You had the Mu'tazila, who prioritized human reason above almost everything.
And various esoteric groups who claimed they had secret, hidden meanings of the Quran that ordinary people couldn't access.
So into all of this chaos steps Ibn Taymiyyah.
Right.
He looks at the physical devastation caused by the Mongols, but he identifies a completely different internal threat.
A threat he thought was actually more dangerous to Islam than the Mongol armies.
Yes. He believed the Quran itself was being infiltrated and corrupted by foreign ideas.
Like Greek philosophy.
Exactly. Aristotelian logic, speculative theology, what the scholars called kalam.
I was actually trying to picture how he viewed this infiltration, and I thought of this analogy.
Okay.
Imagine someone hands you a beautifully clear, pure glass of water. And that water represents the Quran as it was understood by the very first generation of Muslims in the 7th century.
Right, the pure source.
Exactly. But over the next few hundred years, scholars keep coming along and adding drops of food coloring to that glass.
A drop of Greek philosophy here.
Yeah, a drop of Persian cultural myth there, a heavy dose of complex rationalist debate.
A drop of mystical allegory.
Until eventually, by the 13th century, that water is completely dark and murky. You can't even see the pure water anymore.
And Ibn Taymiyyah's entire mission was to build a rigorous filter to strip out all of that accumulated color.
To get back to the original clarity.
He wanted to bypass centuries of theological debate and return directly to the Salaf, the earliest generations.
Because they drank the water when it was still pure.
Right, before all those translations of Greek texts flooded the Islamic world and, in his view, confused everyone's understanding.
Sitting here looking at his ambition, I have to admit, it requires a staggering amount of confidence.
It does.
To stand up in front of the established scholars of his day and say, I am the one building the filter, doesn't that inherently claim that almost everyone else for hundreds of years has been doing it wrong?
Oh, absolutely.
How did he justify such a disruptive stance, especially in a religion that believes only the prophets possess a flawless understanding of God's will?
Well, his critics at the time, and there were many of them, they absolutely accused him of arrogance. They saw him as an upstart tearing down centuries of careful scholarship.
But he defended himself.
He did. He defended himself by making a very sharp epistemological distinction between two Arabic concepts.
Tafseer and Tawil. We should probably define those carefully for the listener, because his entire blueprint basically rests on the difference between those two words.
Yeah, so Tafseer, in his strictly defined framework, is the explanation of the text, based entirely on transmitted evidence.
So you look at the historical record.
Right. You ask, what did the Prophet Muhammad say about this verse? What did his companions say?
How was the Arabic language used by the Bedouins back then?
Exactly. It's an act of historical retrieval.
You are literally searching for the evidence of what was meant at the exact moment of revelation.
Correct. Now, Ta'wil, on the other hand, had evolved by his time to mean speculative, metaphorical reinterpretation.
Speculative, meaning human logic.
Right. It's what happens when a scholar reads a verse, decides it clashes with their own human logic or their philosophical understanding of the universe, and says, well, the text literally says X, but it must actually mean Y.
He viewed that as a massive transgression, didn't he?
He hated it. He felt Ta'wil was essentially humans putting their own words into God's mouth, just disguised as intellectual sophistication.
Wow.
He argued that Allah intentionally revealed the Quran in clear Arabic, which is what the text itself says. It was designed to be a functional guide for ordinary people.
Not a puzzle.
Exactly. Not a convoluted riddle that only a small elite group of philosophers could decode using Aristotelian logic.
So he was basically telling his critics, I'm not offering you my personal opinion.
Right. I am simply clearing away your philosophical debris to reveal what the text originally said.
Okay, let's test the mechanics of that, because if human philosophy, logic, and rational speculation are flawed tools that we have to discard, what tools does he actually leave the everyday Muslim with?
Right.
How do we construct meaning if we can't use our own reasoning?
And this leads us directly into the engine he built, the four-tiered methodology that Ibn Kathir applied to every single verse in his commentary.
And it is profoundly strict.
It is incredibly strict. It's called Tafsir bil Mathir.
Which means exegesis based strictly on transmitted report.
Yes. And he established a hierarchy with 4 very distinct steps. You cannot skip a step, and you absolutely cannot reverse the order.
All right, let's walk the listener through these steps. Suppose you and I come across a verse we just don't understand. Where do we go first?
Step 1 is the most authoritative.
Yeah.
It's the Quran explaining the Quran.
So before you look at any external history or human opinion. You search the rest of the text.
Exactly. The assumption is that the Quran is a perfectly unified whole.
Give me an example of how that works in practice.
A classic example is the opening chapter, Al-Fatiha.
Okay.
Believers ask God to guide them to the straight path, the path of those upon whom you have bestowed favor.
Right, but the verse itself doesn't actually tell us who those favored people are.
Exactly. Now, a philosopher might write a long essay theorizing about who is favored based on, ethics or logic.
But Ibn Taymiyyah would say stop.
He would say stop. Look at Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 69.
What does it say?
It explicitly lists the favored people as the prophets, the steadfast affirmers of truth, the martyrs, and the righteous. So the ambiguity is resolved entirely by the text itself.
That seems entirely logical. I mean, the author is always the best explainer of their own work.
Right.
But obviously, the Quran doesn't provide a perfect cross-reference for every single verse.
No, it doesn't.
So what happens if step 1 comes up empty?
Then you move to step 2, the Quran explained by the Sunnah. You turn to the authentic hadith.
The verified records of what the Prophet Muhammad said and did.
Yes. For example, the Quran commands believers to pray, but it doesn't give the exact physical movements or the times of day.
Right, you need the Prophet's life as the practical living commentary.
Exactly. So if the Prophet explicitly explained a verse, the debate is just over. No scholar can override his explanation.
Okay, let's keep moving down the hierarchy. What if there is a verse where the Quran doesn't explain itself, and we have no recorded statement from the Prophet about it?
You step down to level 3, the understanding of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet.
And this is where people might ask, why them? Why does a companion from the 7th century have more authority over the text than a brilliant, highly educated scholar from the 10th or the 20th century?
Because of proximity to the revelation. The companions were physically present when the verses came down.
They knew the context.
They knew the asbab al-nuzul, the specific historical reasons behind the revelations. They knew who was being addressed in real time.
In their language.
Yes, importantly, they spoke the pure, uncorrupted Arabic of the Quraysh before the language began to mix with Persian and Byzantine dialects.
Because the empire expanded so quickly.
Exactly. So they understood cultural idioms that the later scholar might completely misinterpret.
Proximity equals purity in this framework.
That is the core idea.
And if the companions were completely silent on a verse, what then?
You reach the final step, level 4, the understanding of the tabi'un. These are the immediate students of the companions, the second generation.
Because they didn't see the Prophet, but they learned directly from those who did.
Right. Now, if you exhaust all 4 of these steps and find no clear explanation, Ibn Taymiyyah argues that scholars must exercise extreme caution.
They can't just guess.
They can use linguistic analysis, sure, but they must never introduce an interpretation that contradicts the established consensus of those first generations.
Wow. So the further away you get from the year 632, the less authority you have.
Pretty much.
It is an intensely historical, backward-looking approach.
It forces the scholar to become a historian and an archivist rather than an innovator.
But this brings up a massive friction point, one that his critics attacked relentlessly.
Yeah, they really did.
Because they pointed out that sometimes, if you only look at the literal text in these ancient transmitted reports, it seems to clash with basic human reason or observable reality.
Yes.
How did he resolve the tension between authentic revelation, what he called naql, and sound human reason, aql?
He actually wrote a massive, multi-volume work specifically on this topic. It's called Dar Tarid al-Aqwal Naql.
What's the main premise?
His foundational premise is that true, uncorrupted human reason and authentic divine revelation can never, ever contradict each other.
Because they come from the same source.
Exactly. They both come from the Creator.
So if a scholar is reading a text and it seems completely irrational, what is happening in his view?
He argues that one of 2 errors has occurred. Either the transmitted report, like the hadith or the historical claim, is actually weak and fabricated, so it isn't true revelation, or the human reasoning being applied is flawed.
Ah, so the scholar has confused pure logic with their own cultural assumption.
Right. For Ibn Taymiyyah, if a genuinely authentic text seems to clash with human reason, the text always wins.
Because human intellect is limited.
It's limited, it's biased, and it's prone to error. Revelation is the ultimate unbreakable anchor.
I understand the psychological appeal of that anchor. I really do. When you are living through the trauma of the Mongol invasions and your entire civilization feels like it's dissolving, You want bedrock.
You want something that does not move.
Right. But I want you to imagine the listener today living in the 21st century.
Okay.
If we restrict the meaning of the Quran strictly to how a 7th century community in the desert understood it, aren't we locking the text in a museum?
It's a common critique.
The world has transformed completely. How does a framework that is so entirely tethered to the past provide guidance for a modern Muslim dealing with artificial intelligence or globalized banking or modern medical ethics?
That is the sharpest critique leveled against traditionalism today. Critics argue it creates intellectual paralysis,
Yeah.
but defenders of Ibn Taymiyyah point to a very crucial nuance in his writing that often gets overlooked.
What's the nuance?
He made a strict distinction between the core principles of the text and the application of those principles.
Expand on that. How does that save the methodology from being frozen in time?
Well, he argued that the lexical meanings of the Arabic words, the fundamental theology, and the universal moral principles are permanently fixed.
So justice is always justice.
Exactly. The prohibition of usury, the nature of God, these do not change just because humanity invents new technology. They are eternal.
Okay.
However, the application of those fixed principles to unprecedented circumstances, the process known as ijtihad, is a dynamic, ongoing requirement for the scholars of every era.
Okay, so the foundation doesn't move, but the house built on top of it can be remodeled to fit the environment.
Yes.
The definition of theft remains fixed from the 7th century, but applying that definition to, say, digital cryptocurrency hacking requires new intellectual work.
Exactly. For him, manipulating the actual meaning of the text to suit modern sensibilities or to appease secular pressures is a betrayal of the divine intent.
But deriving new rulings based on those fixed meanings is required.
Right. That's the very purpose of Islamic jurisprudence.
I can see the logic when we are discussing law, morality, or social issues. It provides stability while allowing for practical adaptation.
Wow.
But this rigid 4-step method, this absolute reliance on the literal text, it collided spectacularly with something much more profound and dangerous than legal rulings.
You're talking about theology.
It collided with the nature of God himself.
The theological battlefield. This was the central crisis of Ibn Taymiyyah's life.
It wasn't his legal rulings that caused the most disruption, was it?
No, not at all. It was his literal approach to verses describing the divine. This is what got him accused of heresy.
Dragged before tribunal.
Repeatedly imprisoned by the authorities of his time.
Let's take the listener into that specific controversy, because if you say we can only use the literal text in the early generations, and we are forbidden from using our own philosophical reasoning to reinterpret things, what happens when the Quran explicitly mentions Allah having a hand?
Right.
Or a face?
Right.
Or mentions Allah descending to the lowest heaven in the last third of the night?
This absolutely terrified the mainstream theologians of his era, primarily the Asharis.
Why?
Because they had spent centuries developing a highly sophisticated theology designed to protect the majesty and transcendence of God.
Okay.
They look at those verses and said, we know fundamentally that God is completely unlike human beings. He's outside of space and time.
Right.
Therefore, when the text says hand, it cannot possibly mean a physical hand. It must be a metaphor.
So they used tawil. They reinterpreted the word to protect the concept.
Yes. They argued that hand actually means God's power or his blessing.
And God descending.
They argue that means his mercy is descending, not that God is physically moving through space.
Because they were desperate to prevent the masses from falling into tajsim.
Anthropomorphism.
Imagining God as an old man with physical limbs sitting on a physical throne in the sky.
Precisely. To the Asharis, assigning physical attributes to God was borderline idolatry. It reduced the creator to the level of creation.
But Ibn Taymiyyah looked at their metaphorical interpretations and completely rejected them.
He rejected them entirely. He argued that the Asharis were committing a massive act of overreach.
Because they were changing the words.
In his view, to say hand means power is to speak on behalf of God without any transmitted evidence.
Right.
His argument was essentially, if Allah wanted to communicate power, he has a perfectly good Arabic word for power quadra.
But he chose the word hand, Yad.
Exactly. Who are you, a human philosopher, to cross out God's chosen word and replace it with your own?
That is an accusation of severe intellectual arrogance against the Asharis.
It was. But of course, they fired back immediately.
What did they say?
They demanded to know. If you refuse the metaphor, but you also claim you don't believe God is a human with body parts, where exactly do you stand?
You cannot have it both ways.
Right. And this is where he introduces the concept that defines authority theology, the tradition he championed. It is called ithbat bila kayf.
Which translates to affirming without asking how.
Without how, bila kayf.
Explain to the listener how that actually functions in a believer's mind.
His position requires a very specific mental discipline. He says we must affirm the word hand exactly as it is written because Allah used it to describe himself.
We don't change the word.
We do not change the word. However, simultaneously, we completely and utterly deny that this hand is anything like a human hand.
So no flesh, no bone.
We deny that it has flesh, bone, shape, or physical spatial limits. We affirm the attribute because of revelation, but we delegate the reality of how it exists entirely to God.
You know, when I first encountered this concept, I saw it as an exercise in supreme intellectual humility.
In what way?
Well, it's a believer accepting the word of the text, but freely admitting that the human brain simply lacks the hardware to comprehend the reality of the Creator. We walk right up to the edge of the word and then we stop.
Right. We don't try to peek behind the curtain to figure out the mechanics of God. And classical defenders, like his famous student Ibn al-Qayyim, framed it exactly that way. It establishes a firm epistemological boundary. It acknowledges human limitation.
But I want to push back on this because the critics, both the classical Asharas back then and modern secular philosophers today, look at Bila Kayf and argue that it is nothing more than intellectual gymnastics.
They call it semantic agnosticism.
Let me lay out their argument. Think about how language actually works.
Okay.
If you tell me to use the word hand, but you demand that I strip away flesh, bone, shape, spatial location, and literally everything that defines what a hand is, aren't I just left with empty syllables?
You're just making a sound with your mouth?
Exactly. I've emptied the word of all its conceptual content. Critics argue that this approach inevitably fails in practice.
Because people are visual.
Right. If you tell an ordinary person God has a hand, but not like ours, their brain is still instantly going to picture a physical hand. You cannot tell a human to think of a hand without spatial form.
So it leads the masses right back into the anthropomorphism he claimed to hate.
That's the critique.
And it's a very robust and enduring critique. Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, one of the great Ash'ari intellects, argued almost exactly that.
He thought it was dangerous for the layperson.
Yes, because they haven't trained their mind to separate words from physical forms. But the Athari defense rests heavily on the absolute nature of tanzi, complete transcendence.
How does insisting on transcendence resolve the problem of using an empty word?
Well, Ibn Taymiyyah would argue that the word is not empty at all. It denotes a real, actual attribute of God. The problem, he would say, is not the word. The problem is your human assumption that the word must imply a physical, earthly form.
Can we find an analogy for that? Because it is a very difficult, abstract concept to grasp.
Let's consider human consciousness or human emotions. We understand the concept of anger or love in an abstract sense.
Sure.
We know it exists, we know its effects, but if you try to isolate the physical mechanism of love in a laboratory, you can't point to a shape or a physical object. Now magnify that infinitely. Ibn Taymiyyah argued, we know what God communicated to us through human language, but the reality of those attributes in the divine essence is simply inaccessible to our earthly categories of thought.
He viewed the Ash'ari use of metaphor as the far more dangerous path.
Oh, without question. Because if you open the door to allegorizing the text to make it fit human logic, where do you draw the line?
Today you say hand means power.
Tomorrow, someone else comes along and says heaven and hell are just metaphors for states of mind.
And the next day, someone says the angels are just metaphors for natural forces.
Exactly. Once human logic becomes the ultimate judge of what the text actually means, the objective reality of the revelation collapses entirely. That is what terrified him.
The tension is incredible. He was desperately trying to anchor the text so it couldn't float away into endless philosophical speculation.
He was.
But here's the major issue we have to confront tonight. This strict adherence to the literal text and filtering everything through the reports of the early generations, it doesn't just impact abstract, unseen theology.
No.
It creates massive, tangible friction when we look at the physical world, when we look up at the stars.
Right, the collision with cosmology and modern science. This is where the methodology faces its harshest modern scrutiny.
We have to discuss the muddy spring.
We do.
Because if you spend any time reading modern critiques of the Quran from secular academics, ex-Muslims, or atheist commentators, this is almost always the first example they bring up to discredit the text.
It's heavily cited.
We are talking about Surah Al-Kahf, chapter 18, verse 86. It describes the ancient ruler Dhul-Qarnayn traveling to the furthest western point of his conquests.
And what does the text say?
It says he found the sun setting in a spring of dark mud.
Right. It is a highly scrutinized passage. And when we open Tafseer Ibn Kathir to see how he handles this verse, we see Ibn Taymiyyah's methodology in full effect.
How so?
Well, Ibn Kathir does not try to offer a scientific metaphor. Instead, he includes historical reports from early figures, notably Ka'b al-Ahbar,
who was a prominent Jewish convert to Islam in the first generation.
Yes. And some of these early reports seem to vividly support a literal muddy spring, or they talk about the sun traveling under the earth and prostrating beneath the divine throne at night.
To a listener today, reading that in the 21st century, it sounds completely mythological.
Of course that does.
I mean, we have satellites. We know the Earth orbits the sun in the vacuum of space. The sun is a massive ball of plasma. It does not shrink down and splash into a puddle of mud at the end of the day.
Right. But to understand why those reports are in the book, we must deeply contextualize the scholars. Both Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Kathir operated in the 13th and 14th centuries.
Their worldview was totally different.
The entire educated world at that time, whether Muslim scholars in Damascus, Christian monks in Europe, or Jewish rabbis, believed in a pre-Copernican geocentric universe.
They believed the Earth was the fixed center of creation.
And the heavens were a solid canopy or dome rotating above them. When they read the verse, a literal interpretation did not clash with their scientific understanding of reality.
They weren't writing physics textbooks. They were describing the universe as they understood it.
Exactly.
But let me challenge the methodology here.
Go ahead.
Both Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Kathir explicitly warned against using Israeliyat, the Judeo-Christian myths and folklore that circulated in the early Islamic period.
Yes, they did.
Ibn Taymiyyah's entire brand was filtering out foreign corruption. So why did Ibn Kathir leave in bizarre stories from Ka'b al-Ahbar about the sun setting in mud, or other narrations about the earth sitting on the back of a giant whale?
It seems contradictory.
Doesn't including these mythological reports in the most widely read tafsir in history inadvertently create the very doubts and confusion they were trying to prevent?
It absolutely creates doubt for a modern reader. But we have to inhabit the mindset of the classical muhaddith, the hadith scholar.
Okay, what was their mindset?
Their primary identity, their sacred duty, was preservation. They saw themselves as archivists of the early community's intellectual history.
So they just recorded everything.
Well, Ibn Taymiyyah established a very specific threefold rule for handling Israeliyat.
How did that rule function?
He said, first, if the Judeo-Christian story confirms Islamic law or theology, you can accept it as supplementary.
Makes sense.
Second, if it explicitly contradicts Islamic teachings, you must reject it outright.
Also makes sense.
But the third category is the most relevant here. If the story is neutral, meaning it doesn't impact core legal rulings or fundamental creed regarding God, you neither confirm it nor deny it. You simply preserve the record.
So to Ibn Kathir, whether the sun set in mud or not didn't change how a Muslim prayed, fasted, or understood God's oneness?
No, it didn't. It was a neutral historical curiosity.
They just logged it as data. Here is what some people in the early generations discussed.
They preserved the raw data for future generations to evaluate.
And what about the verse itself? How do modern defenders of the Quran reconcile the text with modern astrophysics without abandoning the methodology?
Both Ibn Kathir and his linguistic notes, and numerous later defenders, point to the specific Arabic verb used in the verse, wajada.
Which translates to?
It translates to he found it, or it appeared to him. The classical defense is that the verse is using phenomenological language.
Phenomenological, meaning it is describing the phenomenon as it is experienced by a human observer, not making an objective scientific claim about the cosmos.
Yes. If you stand on a western shoreline at dusk and watch the sun go down over a dark, murky ocean, it physically looks like the sun is sinking directly into the water.
We use this language every day. We still say sunrise and sunset.
Even though we are fully aware that the sun isn't rising, the earth is rotating.
Right. The defense is that the Quran is accurately describing Dhul-Qarnayn's visual human experience at that specific geographic location. It is not providing an astrophysics lesson. I find that defense very reasonable. But the uncomfortable reality remains. The fact that Ibn Kathir included those extra mythological stories from Qabl Abar alongside the verse proves that the 14th century traditionalist mindset did not inherently object to a literal reading of the cosmos.
Because it fit their geocentric reality.
They couldn't foresee the James Webb Space Telescope. They simply preserved the transmission.
That is the crucial point. They prioritized transmission over all else. And that transmission-heavy approach, that strict adherence to literal readings and historical context, it bleeds into areas far more consequential today than ancient astronomy.
It bleeds directly into law, warfare, and modern sociopolitics.
Yes, it does.
We have to move from the pen to the sword because the implications of Ibn Taymiyyah's methodology are not confined to theological debates in a dusty library or arguments about the solar system.
No, this is where the legacy gets incredibly heated and tangible.
I want to look at the sword verses. We are talking about verses like chapter 2, verse 191, or chapter 9, verse 5.
These are arguably the most heavily scrutinized and debated verses in the entire Quran today.
Let's read the phrase that causes so much alarm: kill them wherever you find them.
Yeah.
Critics point directly to Ibn Taymiyyah's historical fatwas, and they point to Ibn Kathir's exegesis on these specific verses, and they argue that this literal transmission-based methodology is inherently intolerant.
They argue it provides the exact theological fuel needed for modern extremism.
So, to analyze this fairly, we must maintain strict neutrality and examine the historical conditions under which those interpretations were forged.
Right, we have to go back to the existential threat of the Mongols.
Okay.
By the time Ibn Taymiyyah was writing his most famous political fatwas, the geopolitical situation had actually shifted a bit.
How so?
Some of the Mongol rulers, like Ghazan Khan, had nominally converted to Islam.
Wait, so they were claiming to be Muslims, but they were still marching armies against Muslim cities like Damascus?
Exactly. And importantly, while they claimed the Islamic faith, they continued to rule their empire using the Yasa,
Which was?
the ancestral legal code of Genghis Khan, rather than Islamic law, the Sharia.
Okay, I see where this is going.
This created an unprecedented theological crisis. The traditional rules of jihad were designed for conflicts between Muslims and non-Muslim empires.
Right.
How do you legally and theologically justify fighting an invading army that prays the exact same way you do?
Ibn Taymiyyah had to innovate a legal justification for survival.
He did. He developed very strict interpretations around the concept of al-wala wal-bara, loyalty and disavowal.
In his famous Mardin Fatwa.
Yes, and others. He declared that despite their nominal conversion to Islam, the Mongols were legitimate targets for military action.
Because they refused to implement Islamic law.
Because they refused to implement Islamic law and continued to violently threaten the survival of the Muslim community. They were effectively categorized as rebels or apostates of a certain type.
So his reading of the sword verses in this context was entirely mobilized by the need for political and physical survival. I recognize how the terrifying historical moment dictated that severity. When an army is at your gates, you don't write fatwas about peaceful coexistence.
No, you don't.
But here is the profound pushback, and we cannot ignore it.
Okay.
Modern extremist groups in the 20th and 21st centuries routinely cut and paste these exact 14th century fatwas.
They do.
They heavily quote Ibn Kathir's Tafseer on the sword verses, and they drop them directly into a modern civilian context to justify horrific violence against non-Muslims.
And very frequently against other Muslims who disagree with them.
Yes. So if Ibn Taymiyyah's methodology is so rigorous and protective, why is it so easily co-opted by terrorists? What are these modern groups ignoring?
It is the most critical question regarding his legacy today. Mainstream traditional scholars and classical defenders argue that modern extremist groups are committing a massive, deliberate methodological error. They are cherry-picking. They extract the final ruling, the fatwa, but they completely strip away the rigorous mandatory safeguards that Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Kathir required before those verses could ever be applied.
Walk the listener through those missing variables. What safeguards are extremists ignoring?
The first and most vital is Asbab al-Nuzul, the historical context of revelation.
Right.
When Ibn Kathir discusses the command to kill them wherever you find them, he does not present it as a timeless, universal command to hunt down non-believers.
He doesn't.
No. He explicitly locates that verse in the specific historical context of the Quraysh breaking the peace treaty of Hudaybiyah.
So it was a specific military response to a specific act of treason and ongoing persecution.
Exactly. It was a localized rule of engagement for an active battlefield, not a blanket theological directive.
Okay, what else?
Second, extremists ignore the rules of proportionality.
Yeah.
Ibn Kathir actively transmits the hadith of the Prophet that explicitly and strictly forbid the killing of women, children, monks, the elderly, and non-combatants.
Yeah. The methodology demands that the sword verses be read alongside these restrictive hadith.
Yes. You cannot take the Quranic verse and ignore the Prophet's restrictions on it.
So they selectively apply the first step of the methodology but ignore the second step.
Exactly. What else? The requirement of legitimate authority.
Right.
Ibn Taymiyyah required qualified ijtihad by highly trained scholars, and he required a legitimate state authority to declare military action.
So he opposed vigilante violence.
He vehemently opposed vigilante violence or independent groups declaring war on their own. You simply cannot separate his harsh political fatwas from the deep ethical, legal, and state frameworks he operated within.
So an extremist group might quote his conclusion because it sounds fierce, but they are entirely abandoning the rigorous, multi-layered process he demanded to reach that conclusion.
Right. Mainstream scholars argue that the misuse of a methodology by bad actors does not inherently invalidate the methodology itself.
That is the core of their defense. The methodology is a tool. It requires a qualified craftsman to use it properly.
Well said.
We have covered an immense amount of ground tonight.
We really have.
We have looked at the apocalyptic trauma of the 13th century. We've examined the strict four-step engine of his methodology.
We've seen how it causes profound friction with rationalist theology and modern cosmology.
And we've confronted how its literalism has been weaponized in modern geopolitics. Sitting here, looking at the totality of this legacy, where does this leave the everyday person?
That is the big question.
When a Muslim opens Tafseer Ibn Kathir today to understand their faith, is this methodology a fortress that successfully protected the religion, or is it a prison that locks the text permanently in the medieval era?
That tension is the defining modern paradox of Ibn Taymiyyah's legacy.
Yeah.
It has survived centuries, and it forms the absolute bedrock of traditionalist Sunni Islam globally. For millions of people, it undoubtedly acted as a fortress.
It protected the text.
It successfully protected the Quran from being entirely diluted by esoteric mysticism in the past, and it acts as a bulwark against extreme secular modernism today. It provided stability when the world was falling apart.
It anchored the text to history.
Yes, it is the ultimate anchor. His methodology demands accountability. It demands that anyone who steps up to a podium and claims the Quran means X must first answer a very difficult question. What is your textual evidence?
You cannot just rely on your own charisma or your personal philosophy.
No. However, reading this commentary today requires a profound sense of a scholar's humility.
Humility in what sense? How should the reader approach the text?
By recognizing the vital difference between what is eternal divine revelation and what is a 14th century scholar's cosmological, historical, or cultural assumption.
Right.
Ibn Kathir was a master compiler. He transmitted the knowledge, the debates, and the worldview of his specific time faithfully. But the reader today must do the hard work of discernment.
They must extract the timeless theological truth, the moral guidance, the nature of God, the legal principles from the historical vessel it was carried in.
Exactly.
So if someone picks up that massive set of volumes tonight, they shouldn't read it as a book of ultimate, unquestionable answers for every modern scientific query or complex 21st century political issue.
No, it is not a physics textbook.
Yeah.
It is not a modern legal manual.
It is a beautifully meticulous, rigorously guarded archive of how the earliest Muslims interacted with the divine word.
Assembled by men who were desperately trying to hold their shattered world together.
I think that is a deeply fair, respectful, and historically grounded way to interact with the text. It acknowledges the monumental human effort required to preserve the divine message.
It really does.
Which leaves me with one final quiet thought for you, the listener, to mull over before we end tonight. If Ibn Taymiyyah's entire mission, his whole architectural blueprint, was a desperate effort to return to the pure understanding of the text by stripping away the philosophical and cultural assumptions of his own era, what unexamined assumptions from our modern era are we unknowingly projecting onto the Quran today?
Wow.
When we read the text through the lens of modern individualism or modern politics or modern science, are we simply adding new drops of food coloring to the water? Are we doing the exact same thing he sacrificed his freedom to stop?
That is the enduring challenge. It is the question every generation is obligated to ask itself.
May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.